It began in silence, not the silence of peace, but the kind that hides behind curtains and coded words. A hotel room in Zurich. A suitcase. A pistol. And a man who had once stood beneath bright summer skies, catching baseballs before roaring crowds. That man was Moe Berg, former major leaguer, scholar, and polyglot, now an American spy sent to decide whether the fate of millions would rest on a single bullet. For most Americans, Moe Berg was a curiosity, a catcher who read Sanskrit, a ballplayer who lectured on European history. No one imagined that, in the final years of the Second World War, this quiet, eccentric man would be chosen by the Office of Strategic Services to uncover the most dangerous secret in Europe, the Nazi atomic bomb project. He was told, in words that never reached the newspapers, that he might have to kill one man, Werner Heisenberg, Germany's greatest physicist. The mission was simple in its cruelty. If Germany was close to building the bomb, Berg was to eliminate the man who could make it possible. But what happens when a man of intellect and curiosity is asked to weigh one death against the survival of a world? Before the war, Moe Berg was admired for his intelligence more than his batting average. Born in New York City in 1902 to Jewish immigrants, he grew up with a fascination for language and learning. By the time he finished college, he spoke nearly a dozen languages: Latin, Greek, Japanese, German, French. Baseball was his disguise, an American pastime masking a restless mind. When he played for the Chicago White Sox and later the Boston Red Sox, he was known as the brainiest man in baseball. Reporters joked that he read more books than pitches. He was fluent, precise, and endlessly curious, the kind of man who lingered after games in libraries or embassies rather than bars. But war has a way of turning eccentricity into usefulness. By the 1940s, America needed people who could blend in, who could listen, interpret, and vanish. Moe Berg, with his languages and his love of observation, was perfect. The OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, saw in him what others missed: a man comfortable in disguise. He joined without fanfare. His first missions were small: gathering intelligence in Latin America, visiting embassies, assessing loyalties. But soon his assignments grew darker. In 1943, whispers reached Washington. German scientists were experimenting with uranium and heavy water. The Allies feared the unthinkable, that Hitler might soon possess a weapon capable of erasing entire cities. The atomic bomb was no longer science fiction. It was a race. And Germany had started first. At the center of that race was Werner Heisenberg, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist whose uncertainty principle had redefined modern physics. To American intelligence, Heisenberg was both genius and threat, a man whose equations might change the outcome of the war. Was he leading a team toward a German bomb? Or was he simply pursuing pure science under the shadow of the Reich? No one knew. That uncertainty haunted Allied leaders. If they were wrong, if Heisenberg succeeded, the war would end in nuclear fire. So they turned to a spy who could pass unnoticed among scholars. A man who could sit in a lecture hall, ask a question in fluent German, and judge from a single hesitation whether Germany stood on the brink of victory or ruin. That man was Moe Berg. In late 1944, he was sent to Switzerland under the cover of a visiting academic. He carried a small pistol, a cyanide capsule, and an order written in the language of discretion. If Heisenberg's words proved Germany was close to success, he was to shoot him on sight. Imagine it, a former baseball catcher sitting in the front row of a lecture, his finger near a trigger hidden beneath his coat. The life of one scientist, and perhaps the fate of civilization, balanced on his decision. He sat quietly as Heisenberg spoke. The lecture was dense, technical. The physics of nuclear fission, the future of atomic energy. Berg understood enough to follow the rhythm, to sense confidence or doubt. He waited for certainty. For the tone that would betray a breakthrough. For words that would justify a death. But the tone never came. Heisenberg spoke of theory, not triumph. His work, though advanced, seemed far from a practical weapon. The Germans, Berg realized, were not close. They lacked the resources, the coordination, the urgency that the Manhattan Project would soon harness in the United States. And so Berg did not raise his pistol. He listened. He applauded politely. Then he walked into the cold Zurich night, carrying with him a silence that would save a life, and perhaps millions more. Back in Washington, his report was decisive. Germany's nuclear program was scattered, inefficient, and nowhere near completion. The Allied fears eased, and Berg's mission quietly ended, without violence, without glory, without a name on any medal. But history has a strange way of forgetting restraint. We celebrate the men who act, not the ones who choose not to. We remember the generals, not the spies who kept their weapons holstered. Yet sometimes the most moral act in war is the refusal to kill. After the war, Moe Berg never returned to baseball. He drifted, consulting for the CIA, visiting old friends, living out of hotels. When people asked about his wartime work, he smiled and changed the subject. Some said he was lonely. Others said he was haunted. Perhaps he simply understood what few ever do, that true espionage leaves you invisible not only to the world but to yourself. Years later, a Swiss official would recall the strange American who had appeared at their conferences, polite, fluent, and somehow unreadable. "Anyone in America," he said in disbelief, "can be a spy." It was a compliment and a warning. Moe Berg's story lingers not as a tale of violence but of choice. A reminder that power, even when justified, must be measured against conscience. In an age when science and secrecy danced on the edge of annihilation, a quiet man with a curious mind stood between destruction and restraint. He was a ballplayer, a linguist, a spy, and in his silence perhaps a savior. The question remains, if it had been you in that room with the world's fate hanging on a trigger, would you have pulled it? If stories like this make you question history, imagine how many others are buried in silence. Subscribe to the channel and keep watching. The truth hides in the unlikeliest of places. When Moe Berg returned to America, the war was nearing its violent conclusion. The atomic bomb, once a rumor whispered among physicists, was now a living reality. Los Alamos had become the new cathedral of destruction, and the men inside were writing a new gospel in uranium and plutonium. Berg knew some of them. He had met Oppenheimer before the war, heard him lecture about cosmic rays and quantum behavior. He had spoken to Enrico Fermi, the Italian genius who had fled Mussolini and built the first nuclear reactor beneath a stadium in Chicago. To Berg, these men represented both the light and the shadow of human brilliance. They were the proof that intellect could outpace morality. While the Manhattan Project raced ahead, Berg's mission faded into silence. Officially, he returned to Washington and continued intelligence work. Unofficially, he carried a private understanding that few others could comprehend, that he had stood at the edge of preemptive murder and turned back not from fear, but from judgment. But what happens to a man who has tasted that kind of power? For a while, he was assigned to the Balkans desk, analyzing reports from occupied Europe. He worked long hours, rarely spoke, and refused promotions. His superiors described him as brilliant but impossible to manage. He had seen too much to believe in orders. The OSS was filled with men like him, poets, professors, soldiers, gamblers, all tied together by secrecy and paranoia. The organization itself was a grand experiment, born from desperation and improvisation. In 1945, when it dissolved into the structure that would become the CIA, most agents returned to ordinary life. But Berg had no ordinary life to return to. Baseball was behind him, and espionage had left him with an addiction to silence. He drifted from job to job, consulting here, advising there, often without pay. He refused steady employment. He carried a briefcase full of papers he rarely opened and moved from hotel to hotel like a ghost. Some said he was still working for the government. Others believed he was simply lost, unable to re-enter a world that moved too quickly for him to matter. His friends tried to help. Old teammates offered connections, universities invited him to lecture, but Berg declined. He lived with his sister for a while, then alone, always reading, always wandering. When asked what he did for a living, he would smile faintly and say, "I'm still catching." Was he joking? Or did he mean something deeper, that he was still catching fragments of history, whispers of what might have been, ghosts of choices never made? In the years after the war, Heisenberg too would live under the shadow of what did not happen. He returned to Germany, lecturing on physics, rebuilding academic life from the ruins. He denied ever trying to build a bomb. He insisted that his work had been pure, theoretical, detached from Hitler's ambition. But others doubted him. Some said he had simply failed. And somewhere, across an ocean, Moe Berg listened to the rumors and wondered whether he had spared a man who deserved sparing, or merely postponed the inevitable. The Cold War changed everything. Nuclear secrets became the new currency of power, and spies were the brokers. The United States and the Soviet Union each built arsenals beyond comprehension. What Berg had once been sent to prevent had now become policy. The nightmare he had worked to avoid was no longer a threat, it was a strategy. Imagine what that felt like for him. To have risked his life to stop a weapon, only to watch his own country perfect it. He never spoke publicly about it, but those who met him in the late 1940s said his eyes carried a kind of quiet disappointment, as if he had glimpsed a version of the world that could have been better, and knew it was already gone. There are photographs of him from that time, thin, well-dressed, his smile polite but unreadable. The caption always the same, Moe Berg, former baseball player. Never spy. Never assassin who refused. History has a habit of sanding down the edges of uncomfortable men. By the early 1950s, Berg was living on the margins of Washington and New York. He visited bookstores, libraries, and embassies. He spent afternoons in cafes, reading newspapers from Europe, circling articles with a fountain pen. Once in a while he would send a note to a friend in the intelligence community, a small piece of information, an observation. It was unclear whether anyone still paid him. He remained in every sense an operative without an operation. It is said that the greatest spies are those who disappear without trace, whose legends dissolve into ordinary life. Berg embodied that principle so completely that even the government forgot him. When he died in 1972, few attended the funeral. The newspapers printed short obituaries, each one mentioning baseball first, espionage second, and philosophy not at all. But if we look closer, beneath the statistics and the trivia, we find something rarer. A man who lived at the intersection of knowledge and morality, who understood that every piece of information carries a human cost. In wartime, nations tell themselves that killing is necessary, that knowledge must serve power. But Berg's story complicates that. He stood in a room where he could have altered history with a single shot, and chose restraint. Was that courage? Or cowardice? Some intelligence officers later argued that Berg should have pulled the trigger. They believed Heisenberg's death might have accelerated Germany's defeat or prevented a future arms race. Others countered that it would have been a moral and strategic catastrophe, an American spy assassinating a Nobel laureate in neutral Switzerland. The diplomatic fallout could have changed the post-war order entirely. History, of course, will never know. But perhaps that's the point. Some stories are not about what happened but about what almost happened. The spaces between action and inaction, between orders and conscience. The OSS would remember Berg as an eccentric genius, unreliable yet indispensable. A man impossible to categorize, too intellectual for soldiers, too pragmatic for scholars, too restless for civilians. And yet, beneath that confusion lies something quietly heroic. He preserved humanity in a profession that rewards the absence of it. Moe Berg's life reminds us that espionage is not only about deception, but also about restraint, about knowing when to listen, when to wait, when not to pull the trigger. And in that restraint, there is a kind of grace. The baseball diamond and the battlefield could not be further apart, but both teach the same lesson. Timing is everything. He learned that long before Switzerland, the patience to watch the ball, the discipline to hold until the right moment. On the field, hesitation cost the game. In Zurich, hesitation saved the world. Decades later, his story would resurface in declassified files and obscure documentaries. Each time, the public reacted with disbelief. How could a baseball player become a spy? How could a man known for his wit and quiet manners be entrusted with such a brutal choice? The truth is simpler. War transforms the unlikely. It takes the curious, the clever, the overlooked, and turns them into instruments of survival. And perhaps that is why his story still resonates, because it reminds us that history is not always written by soldiers or presidents, but by the quiet watchers who never ask for credit. He died without family of his own, his ashes scattered over Israel, the homeland of his faith. Fitting, perhaps, for a man who spent his life moving between worlds, athlete and scholar, patriot and outsider, witness and participant. Somewhere in his scattered papers, a line is said to have been found, written in his own hand. Perhaps the secret of life is not knowing which side you're on, but remembering why you chose. That sentence, like his silence, feels like both confession and warning. If history teaches us anything, it's that intelligence work does not end when wars do. It only changes shape. Somewhere, right now, another quiet man or woman is sitting in a room, holding a file, asked to make a choice that will never be written in any book. Will they choose restraint or action? Will they remember that a single decision can tilt the balance between civilization and ruin? We like to believe we would do the right thing. But history shows how fragile that belief can be. So before we judge Moe Berg, before we decide whether he was brave or afraid, we might ask ourselves, what would we have done in his place? Would we have listened to the voice of reason, or to the order of fear? Would we have chosen to act or to wait? Sometimes the most difficult courage is the courage to hold still. And maybe that is why his story still matters, because restraint in the right moment can be as powerful as any weapon ever built. If you've stayed with this story, think about what it means to you. What kind of person would you be in that room in Zurich? Comment below, I want to hear what you think. And if you want to uncover more of these untold histories, stories of the quiet and the unseen, subscribe to the channel. The next secret might be hidden in plain sight. Years passed and the world moved faster than Moe Berg ever could. The Cold War turned science into strategy and physics into fear. What he once sought to prevent had now become the very foundation of global politics. Nations no longer feared armies, they feared equations. The bomb was no longer a secret. It was a currency, traded, measured, paraded in parades of power. The horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had made the atom both sacred and profane. It was the weapon that ended one war and began every one after. In this new world, men like Berg were relics and prophets at the same time. Relics because the OSS's old style of human espionage, the personal whisper, the coded letter, the man who listened behind closed doors, was slowly being replaced by machines, satellites, and bureaucracy. Prophets because they had already understood the moral paradox at the center of it all. Knowledge saves and knowledge destroys. He lived quietly through the 1950s, as McCarthyism swept across America and suspicion became a kind of public theater. Everyone could be a spy now, a neighbor, a teacher, a friend. In some ironic way, the Swiss official's panic statement had come true. Anyone in America can be a spy. Berg had heard those words once in passing and they stayed with him. Not as praise but as prophecy. He understood that when secrecy becomes normal, trust dies a slow death. Perhaps that's why he never sought attention. Fame demands exposure. Spies survive on shadows. And maybe he had grown weary of both. He spent many of his final years visiting libraries, sitting in reading rooms, and revisiting the subjects that once fascinated him before the war: linguistics, philosophy, and baseball statistics. He collected fragments of memory the way others collected medals. Sometimes at night he would tell acquaintances fragments of his wartime experience. Never enough to reveal details, just enough to leave an impression. One story he liked to repeat, almost as a riddle, was that he once saved a man's life without touching him. He never said who. Those who knew his past understood what he meant. There's something haunting about a man who carries both a weapon and a conscience, who is ordered to kill yet chooses not to. Historians later debated whether Berg's decision truly mattered. They pointed out that Germany's nuclear program had been doomed by its own inefficiency, that Heisenberg's ambitions were more academic than military. But that's not the point. The point is that Berg didn't know that then. He made his choice in uncertainty, the same uncertainty that Heisenberg had described years earlier in his famous principle, that you can never know both position and momentum at once. That observation defines physics, but it also defines morality. Berg lived it. He could not know the full truth of Germany's progress, nor the full consequence of his action. He could only observe, measure, decide, in motion, under pressure, with the world's fate hidden in probability. It is no coincidence that his life and Heisenberg's intersected like parallel equations. Each man represented one side of a paradox: the scientist who sought to unlock the atom, and the spy who sought to stop him. And somewhere between them lay the mystery of conscience. We often imagine spies as ruthless, detached, calculated. But Moe Berg's legacy forces us to see them differently, as individuals burdened by choice, working in the space between loyalty and morality. He was not a killer by nature. He was a listener, an observer, a man who preferred precision to chaos. That made his mission all the more tragic. Imagine him standing in that Zurich hotel room before the lecture, loading his pistol. The steady hands of an athlete, the calm of a scholar, and yet the turmoil of a man rehearsing murder. He must have looked in the mirror and seen not a hero or an assassin, but something harder to name: a man unmade by possibility. What do you see when you look in such a mirror? He would carry that reflection for the rest of his life. There are people who say Berg lived too long in the gray zone of intelligence work, that the constant ambiguity eroded his sense of self. But maybe that's the price of seeing too much truth. Once you've watched nations disguise fear as policy, it becomes impossible to believe in pure motives again. Even in baseball, the game he once loved, he saw deception, signals, feints, strategies hidden in plain sight. Everything became a metaphor for intelligence. Every move had meaning beyond itself. By the 1960s, as America prepared for another kind of war in Vietnam, Berg was already a forgotten man. The new generation of spies wore suits and sat behind desks. They analyzed photographs, not people. They intercepted signals, not conversations. The art of listening, the slow, patient craft of observation, had been replaced by machines. But machines don't have morality. They only measure. Maybe that's why Berg's story feels so human. He was a man caught between two centuries, between the world of handshakes and secrets and the world of algorithms and annihilation. When he read about new weapons being tested in the deserts of Nevada, he would shake his head slowly, as if watching a game that had gone too far. Once, according to a friend, he murmured, "We learned how to end the world before we learned how to understand it." That might have been his epitaph. And yet, he never condemned science itself. He loved knowledge. What he feared was certainty, the arrogance that comes when men believe they have mastered forces they barely comprehend. Maybe that's why he admired Heisenberg even as he was ordered to kill him. The German physicist's entire life had been about uncertainty, about accepting limits to what could be known. In a sense, Berg's mission mirrored that philosophy, to act or not to act based on incomplete knowledge. In the end, both men survived the war. Both lived to see the power they had studied or observed reshape the world. And both carried a silence that could not be explained. It's tempting to imagine them meeting again, years later, at some conference or quiet gathering, two old men bound by the secret gravity of what might have been. Perhaps they would speak about science or baseball or nothing at all. Perhaps the unspoken understanding between them was enough. Sometimes history doesn't need confrontation. It only needs recognition. Moe Berg's story, like Heisenberg's, is a reminder that intelligence and morality rarely walk the same path. The man who knows the most may also be the one least certain of what to do. And maybe that's the essence of being human, to act in shadow with imperfect vision, and hope the light finds us anyway. Heisenberg once said that, "The atoms themselves are not material things, they are tendencies." Moe Berg might have said the same about choices. Tendencies. Probabilities. In the end, the difference between peace and catastrophe might be no more than a hesitation, a single second of restraint from one man in a crowded room. History rarely records that kind of heroism. But maybe it should. If you're still listening, ask yourself, how many moments like that have passed unnoticed? How many wars have been averted not by action, but by inaction? We celebrate explosions, not silences. But silence, in the right hands, can save the world. So before you go, consider this. If the past were a field, Moe Berg walked its boundaries. He caught what others missed. He stood between the pitcher and the storm, waiting, watching, deciding whether to throw or not. That was his gift. And his burden. By the time Moe Berg reached old age, history had already moved on. The world was divided not by trenches but by ideologies, and the quiet chess game of espionage had become global. The Cold War was now the age of the invisible, of satellites, of wires, of men who never appeared in the newspapers but shaped every headline. And yet, Berg was still the same, a solitary man walking through the crowded streets of New York with an unreadable face. He had no family, no wealth, no public story. Just a lifetime of secrets and a sense that he had once been part of something that could never be spoken aloud. Sometimes he would visit old baseball parks, sit in the stands long after the crowd had left and stare at the field. Those who noticed him assumed he was simply nostalgic, a man revisiting his youth. But the truth was quieter and deeper. Baseball, for Berg, had always been about order, the geometry of motion, the balance between timing and chaos. Espionage in its own way was not so different. Both demanded patience. Both punished mistakes. And both depended on silence. He would watch the empty field and think about the men he had met in Europe, scientists, soldiers, politicians. He would think about Heisenberg, about the moment when science itself became a weapon, and about the terrifying speed with which knowledge could outgrow conscience. He had seen firsthand how intelligence was built not on truth but on interpretation. Facts were malleable, motives uncertain. Even during the war, reports often contradicted each other. What was true one week could be false the next. Decisions had to be made anyway. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous lesson of all, that human survival often depends on guesswork. What would you do if you were asked to kill a man not because of what he had done, but because of what he might do? Could you live with that choice? Could you sleep knowing you were both executioner and gambler? Moe Berg carried those questions like a private weight. He had no medals, no honors, no official recognition. His service remained classified for years after his death. Only fragments of his missions emerged later, pieced together from declassified OSS files. Each fragment told the same story: a man sent to the edge of morality and left there without guidance. Some described him as lonely, others as enigmatic. Perhaps he was both. Loneliness is the tax on secrecy. He lived off small government stipends and the kindness of friends. He read constantly: history, physics, philosophy. He seemed to be searching for a language that could explain what had happened to him. But there was none. How do you describe a life defined by restraint? In a world that celebrates victory, who tells the stories of those who held back? Even in intelligence circles, he became a kind of myth. Younger agents whispered about the baseball player who had almost assassinated Heisenberg, the man who had been ready to change the world with one bullet. Some admired his discipline. Others thought he lacked nerve. But those who truly understood espionage knew better, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is nothing. Berg's decision not to shoot was not hesitation. It was discernment. He had read Heisenberg's tone, his words, his posture, the faint humility of a man speaking not like a weapon maker but like a scientist still lost in theory. Berg understood nuance when others demanded certainty. That understanding spared a life, and perhaps preserved a moral line that would otherwise have vanished in the smoke of war. Years later, when the CIA was formed, Berg was offered a place within its new structure. He declined. "I'm done with that world," he said quietly. "Too many shadows." But could anyone really be done with it? The habits of espionage never leave you. They become instinct: the way you scan a room, the way you listen before speaking, the way you measure silence as carefully as sound. Friends would notice how he always sat facing the door, how he never trusted telephones, how he rarely slept through the night. Once, someone asked him if he regretted not pulling the trigger. He looked away for a long moment, then said, "You can always kill a man later. You can never unkill him." That sentence lingered in the air, half wisdom, half confession. He might not have known it, but those words would outlive him. They captured something timeless: the fragile difference between power and wisdom, between fear and patience. It's easy to act, harder to understand. In the final years of his life, Berg spent his days visiting universities, occasionally attending lectures just to listen. Professors who didn't know who he was assumed he was an eccentric retiree. Students thought he was a harmless old man taking notes for pleasure. None realized that the quiet figure in the back row had once been authorized to alter the course of history. Heisenberg, meanwhile, continued to teach in Germany, still defending his role during the war. He maintained that he had never intended to build a bomb for Hitler, that he had deliberately slowed the process, miscalculated or misled his superiors. Some believed him, others did not. But Berg never spoke against him. Never accused. Never justified. Maybe he understood that in war, truth becomes fragmented, and guilt is often shared by everyone and no one at once. There is an old saying: the first casualty of war is truth. For Moe Berg, perhaps the second was certainty. He spent much of his later life visiting old teammates, reminiscing about simpler times. They would ask him about the war and he would smile and say, "That's a long story." And it was. A story too long, too complex, too heavy for casual conversation. He had seen what happened when human curiosity met human cruelty. He had watched science turn into strategy and knowledge into power. He knew that behind every discovery there lurked a question: should we? He died quietly in 1972 alone, leaving behind boxes of books, notebooks, and unanswered letters. His ashes were taken by his family to Israel and scattered on Mount Scopus, overlooking Jerusalem, a fitting resting place for a man who lived between worlds, between belief and doubt, between America and the shadows. No monuments, no ceremonies, no parades. Just silence. But maybe that's how he would have wanted it. Because Moe Berg understood something the rest of us often forget: that history is not made only by those who act, but also by those who refuse. The story of Moe Berg is the story of a civilization standing at the edge of its own brilliance, staring into the abyss of what it could destroy, and deciding, if only for a moment, to step back. We live in that moment still. Every generation stands on that same edge, between creation and destruction, between curiosity and arrogance. And the question never changes: what will we do with the knowledge we have? Every era believes it understands its own morality, until history proves otherwise. In Moe Berg's time, the world justified secrecy in the name of survival. Today we justify it in the name of security. The words change, but the logic remains. The story of Moe Berg forces us to look closely at the thin line between knowledge and destruction, between the pursuit of truth and the manipulation of it. He lived in an age when men of science and men of war became indistinguishable, when curiosity itself could be considered a weapon. And that is the paradox that still defines us. For centuries, humanity has treated knowledge as virtue. We believed that the more we understood, the safer we would be. But Berg's story suggests otherwise. Knowledge, when divorced from conscience, becomes its own form of blindness. It feeds the illusion that mastery equals morality. When Moe Berg chose not to kill Heisenberg, he did more than spare a life. He placed a limit on that illusion. He reminded the world, even if silently, that information without judgment is just chaos disguised as progress. And yet, the world kept running toward that chaos. In the decades after the war, thousands of bombs were built. Cities designed entire plans for annihilation. Children practiced hiding beneath desks that would never protect them. Perhaps Berg watched all this unfold and understood that restraint was not contagious. It cannot be taught, it can only be lived. He had once held the world's fate in a single decision. The irony is that no one ever thanked him for making the right one. Maybe that's the way of true morality: it leaves no applause, only absence. The silence after the crowd. The stillness after the storm. And in that stillness, the faint echo of a question that never goes away: when power meets conscience, which one wins? We live in an age of surveillance far beyond anything Berg could imagine. Every phone, every screen, every word we speak leaves a trace. The idea of a spy as a man in a trench coat has become almost romantic. But his legacy lingers in the code, the satellites, the unseen eyes of modern intelligence. We are all, in some way, both watchers and the watched. And perhaps that is why his story still resonates, because he reminds us that the cost of knowledge is never paid at once. It accrues quietly, in choices, in silences, in the small moral hesitations that define who we are. In the grand theater of war, we remember the victories, the speeches, the explosions. We rarely remember the moments of doubt, the seconds when someone, somewhere, refused to pull a trigger. But history, if we listen closely, is full of those moments. Moments where humanity won, not by domination, but by restraint. Maybe Moe Berg was one of those invisible victors. He once said, in a rare moment of candor, that he loved the game of baseball because it rewards the man who waits. That might have been his philosophy for life itself. To wait. To observe. To let the truth reveal itself before acting. It sounds simple, until you realize how much courage that requires. In war, hesitation can look like weakness. In life, it can be wisdom. When we look back on his story now, it is easy to romanticize him. The brilliant catcher turned spy, the scholar with a pistol in his pocket, the man who could have changed history with one decision. But perhaps the real lesson lies in the quiet truth that no one noticed him at all. He moved through the world like a shadow. He left behind no speeches, no confessions, no memoirs. Only the faint trace of a man who understood that even heroes can exist in silence. And in that silence there is dignity. The Swiss official's words, "Anyone in America can be a spy," were meant as alarm. But they also captured something more profound. They reflected a truth about democracy itself, that ordinary people, armed only with conscience and courage, can become guardians of civilization. Moe Berg was not a soldier or a general. He was a man who read books, asked questions, and paid attention. He did what history demanded of him, and then stepped back into the shadows. He never sought credit because he knew that the moral weight of what he had carried could never be measured by medals. The only proof that he had done something extraordinary was that the world had survived to forget him. And maybe that is the truest kind of legacy, one that needs no recognition, only understanding. Because sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in silence. They are not written in history books. They do not appear in photographs. They exist only in the pause between knowledge and action, the second when a man chooses humanity over obedience. So the next time you hear about war or power or weapons designed to protect us by threatening everyone else, remember this. A century ago, a quiet man sat in a room in Switzerland with a gun and a question. And in that single moment of restraint, he defined what it means to be human. History will not remember the silence he created. But the world we live in today still echoes with it. If this story made you think, if it reminded you that history is not made only by force but by choice, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and uncover more stories like this, stories of the unseen, the unspoken, the forgotten. Because sometimes the smallest decisions create the loudest echoes. And somewhere in those echoes Moe Berg still waits, the catcher who saved the world by not throwing the ball.